Good afternoon. My name is Stacia Stelk, and I'm pleased to welcome you to Deep Roots Native Gardening Webinar Series. Deep Roots is hosting these webinars on Tuesday afternoons at 4 o'clock Central Time. To find out about upcoming webinars or to watch one that you might have missed, please visit our website and click on Webinars in the drop-down box under Events. When you're outside this week, please don't forget to enter our native plant giveaway contest in partnership with Boulevard Brewing Company. Take a photo of yourself with your favorite native plant and post it with hashtag native plant fling, tag Deep Roots KC, and Fling Cocktails for your chance to win a prize of Boulevard's Fling Cocktails and some beautifully illustrated native plant note cards designed by local artist Nancy Waugh. We're drawing 2 winners each week, so good luck. Before we get started, don't forget to ask questions using Zoom's Q&A tool and to make comments with its chat feature. At the end of today's presentation, we'll be sure to take a few minutes to answer some of the most popular questions. This afternoon, Deep Roots is thrilled to have David Dods join us to talk about water-loving plants. As a kid, David enjoyed stomping around in creeks, playing in the rain, building dams and roadside ditches. He hasn't changed much as an adult. Today, he works professionally as an environmental engineer and spends his days designing landscapes for stormwater management, water pollution control, cleanup of hazardous waste sites, and habitat restoration. David is known around town as the Raingarden Guy, and he's co-author of the book, The Blue Thumb Guide to Raingardens. So please join me in welcoming David to discuss favorite native plants for wet areas.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. Appreciate you taking time out of your afternoon to log into Deep Roots here to talk about plants and flowers for wet areas. We are broadcasting today from scenic Parkville, Missouri, overlooking the banks of the Missouri River, an apt location to talk about wet and soggy spots. My co-presenters today are Mudpie and Dot. Mudpie does most of the landscaping here, Dot supervises, and I just take photos and narrate their work. So I'm going to talk about 3 things today. First, we're going to start off talking a little bit about what is a rain garden and where are they used. I'll show you 4 or 5 example rain garden locations where people have constructed gardens specifically to catch rainwater or stormwater runoff or solve soggy spots in their yards. We'll talk about how wet they are and the characteristics of each of the gardens that might be applicable to your home yards. Then the second part is just as important, talk about the thought process on how to go about picking plants for soggy spots in rain gardens. Then we'll get into the fun part with a whole bunch of photos of favorite plants that work well in rain gardens, wet and soggy spots. So a rain garden is a garden it's a lowered bed garden, a garden created in a shallow bowl made to catch rainwater or stormwater runoff. And we pick plants that don't mind getting wet on occasion, that have deep roots that help the water soak back into the soil. In the process, they slow runoff. They can help solve erosion problems in your yard, dry up wet spots. They filter pollutants that come off of driveways and roads. And in the process, we can create some really nice pollinator habitat along the way. Here's the garden in our yard. It's at the bottom of our driveway. The runoff from the concrete in our driveway used to run out into the yard. And so we created a shallow bowl here next to the driveway, planted a black gum tree in it that likes being wet, along with some sedges and irises and other things. So this filters the water that drains off our driveway, slows it down, waters the tree, and then helps prevent erosion where the water used to run out through the yard on the side. So in this case, the garden is sometimes wet and dry a lot of the time as well. After a rainstorm, it'll hold water for about a day, and then it dries out after that. This is one in another residential yard where several of the roof downspouts just drained out into the yard, and this is the low spot in the back of the yard. So they had this low, wet, soggy area in the back corner of the yard where all the downspouts drained to. The grass didn't grow too well here. So you can see they created a nice triangular shaped garden in the corner of the lot here, filled it full of appropriate plants for the moist conditions, and created a really nice native habitat and pollinator garden in the process. This one probably stays a little bit wet a little bit longer than my garden because it's at the bottom of the hill and it catches runoff from several downspouts. But like mine, this one will dry out between rainstorms as well. Here's a garden I helped a friend create. In the upper left corner, you maybe can see where my cursor is, that pipe is the downspout from the house. It used to run under the sidewalk and out into the yard where it created an erosion gully. So we built up a shallow retaining wall here to match the other landscaping in the yard, filled it with sedges and rushes and irises and some other flowers that like being wet. And so after a rainstorm, it'll fill up with water like this. But in this case, this one dries out very quickly because we have a stacked rock wall, so it doesn't hold water for a long time. And this one, I put this slide in for Stacia. She's got a sump pump in her house, and that's what we're looking at here. This is a sump pump garden. The sump pump drains out into the yard, creates a wet spot in the yard. They put a bird bath in and a rain garden around it. And what's important for this application and Stacia's case is the sump pump pumps every day. And so this location stays very wet compared to some of the others that dry out between storm events. So this is very wet conditions where the others were sort of average to moist conditions between rainstorms. And this is the Ruiz Library, Kansas City, west side of town. The runoff from the sidewalk, the patio, as well as the downspouts in the front of the building used to drain off here. Pond in the grass here created a puddle. Some of the water would back up onto the sidewalk. And so the garden was put in to catch the runoff from these hardscapes, give the water a place to drain, and create some attractive landscaping in the process. And the other benefit of this one is it does give the water a place to go where it used to puddle alongside the sidewalk. So it reduces slip and trip falls and can help reduce icing in the winter to keep water from backing up onto the sidewalk. So those are several typical applications in a residential or commercial yard. Wet spots next to driveways, patios, downspouts, where the water runs and collects in the bottom of the yard, places like that. So when you're thinking about picking plants for rain gardens, there's three things I'd like you to consider. One is, how long does the garden stay wet? I'll show you an example there. There are different planting zones in rain gardens, so you have different plant choices depending whether you're planting in the middle or the edges of the gardens. And then a few thoughts on plant growth characteristics that make them applicable to rain gardens, wet spots, and home yards. So the photos we just looked at of example gardens, both of these are the extremes. Both are rain gardens, both get wet when it rains. The one in the lower right dries out very quickly between rainstorms. The one in the upper left, similar to Stacia's yard, stays wet all the time because the sump pump pumps every day. So that's the first thing to look at in your yard is observe the wet location or where you might put a rain garden or where you have a drainage problem and watch it. Does it dry out quickly between rainstorms? Does the water hang around for a day or two? Or do you have a spot that truly stays wet for many, many days on end? That will influence how we pick plants for the gardens. And then the second thing to consider is the garden planting zones. In this illustration here, by the way, my partner in crime in this work is Kate Barsotti, a very talented artist here in Kansas City who does interpretive signage for native landscaping, as well as she's a children's book author, illustrator, very talented lady here in Kansas City. So I want to give a shout out to Kate for helping me illustrate the presentations. But anyway, we're creating a shallow garden here. It's a shallow bowl, 6 to 8 inches deep, made to catch water. And in my yard, mine's about 4 or 5 inches deep. And when it fills up with water, you can see here in the middle is going to be the deepest, wettest spot of the garden. So that's where I put the plants that like moist to wet conditions. My sedges, the marsh milkweed, the marsh blazing star, things like that. At the same time, the very edges of the garden can actually be quite dry, or they dry up quickly between rainstorms. Like on the left edge here, that's sometimes I use prairie drop seed in my gardens, which likes dry conditions. Even though it's a rain garden, I just put it on the high dry edges. And in the middle, or halfway up the side slopes where the water only gets a couple inches deep, that's where I put a lot of the flowers that like average conditions. The purple cone flowers, things like that. So there's different planting zones within a garden if you have a bowl shape like this. And here's a picture of an example rain garden that we had just constructed. Not all the sod was put in around it. This was off the edge of a parking lot. And it happened to rain the day after we constructed the garden. This is about eight hours after the rainstorm. The water's already started to soak away. And you can see how in the bottom of the garden, we still have water half a day later, and the edges are already drying out. So that illustrates how you can have different planting zones within the garden, even though it's called a rain garden. And then just like in any landscaping, you have to think about the growth characteristics of the plant. In our case, we're very concerned about the moisture preferences. We'll talk about that in a moment. Of course, sun shade preferences for picking any native plant. And then plant size and aggressiveness is a concern in the home yard. This case, my wife is 5'2", so you can see the New England aster here is 11 or 12 feet tall. Any photographer knows I just compressed the photo to make it look that way. But the point is, some plants, like the New England aster here, loves wet conditions, but it's too big for most small gardens. And we'll talk as we go through some of the plant selections about sizing of plants too. For this presentation, I tried to focus on plants that were 1 to 3 feet tall, things that aren't too terribly big for the home landscape. Okay, favorite plants. Mud Pie's got a purple coneflower there. Dot's a big fan of the coneflowers for the nectar sources. I embedded in the presentation here 3 charts with some of my favorite plants. I'm not going to go through the charts line by line. I just wanted you to know that if you refer back to the videos after Deep Roots posts them, we have some plant lists built into the presentation today. So the first screen here is sedges, rushes, and grasses. And my little bar chart nomenclature, the blue bars are the moisture preferences, and the yellow bars are the sun shade preferences. So like the palm sedge here, we'll take average to wet conditions, full sun, to part to almost full shade. So you can refer back to this at a later date just by pulling up the video on their website. So we've got sedges, rushes, and a couple grasses in here. The next page is Dot's favorite, the flowers. Same thing, moisture preferences on the left, sun shade preferences on the right to help you pick them for the conditions in your yard. And then the last page is some shrubs and trees that also tolerate moist to wet conditions. So that will be built into the website here. Or you can go to your favorite plant catalog and look up the same sort of information. And we're looking for dry, average, moist, or wet conditions. And you pick the plants to go in the zones of the garden that I showed you a moment ago, from the bottom to the side edges. Okay, so getting to the plants now. In wet and soggy areas, rain gardens, I tend to use sedges as my foundation plant. This is usually my starting point. This is my home rain garden. Sedges look like grasses, but they have triangular stems, very attractive foliage, and they come in a wide range of species, some that like very wet conditions, like the tussock sedge here, which would go in the bottom of a rain garden. Palm sedge, which is kind of on the side of my drainage channel here, likes average to moist conditions. And there's even some that tolerate dry conditions. Cedar sedge is actually up on a little mound here, so it doesn't get as wet as the other two. So that's a really good starting point for the bottom part of the garden that tends to get the most water. And Mud Pie tells me that if you were to just pick one sedge for a broad range of conditions, palm sedge would be it. And I would tend to agree with it. This is one in our home garden that was a volunteer that escaped from a rain garden and landed up in our butterfly garden by the road, which is high and dry and very hot in the summer, and it's thriving there. It must like being next to the fire hydrant here. I've seen these grow in very wet conditions, and also clearly this one tolerates pretty darn dry conditions. They tolerate full sun to part shade, and they green up very early in the spring, have a nice, pretty sort of lime green color early in the spring, one of the first things to start greening up. So if you're not sure what to start with, this is a nice sedge to begin with. It does spread a little bit over time, forms nice masses, but does not grow very aggressively. Puts out a lot of seeds, and I've harvested the seeds and replanted them, and so this is a good one for seed collecting as well. Three other sedges that you'll see in some of the nurseries around here. Tussock sedge in the middle is a fairly common one. Forms tussocks or large mounds in very wet conditions. Gray's sedge has this kind of interesting little star club-shaped seed head, so that is something that you can harvest for dried flower arrangements. It's kind of nice. And Frank's sedge over here is maybe not as showy as the other two, but it tolerates part shade, and I believe this one will spread and fill in if you've got erosion problems. So if you have a location that's really, really wet and stays wet, Stacia, these are good ones to start with along with the palm sedge. Another plant that works quite well here for very wet conditions is a rush. Typically you see very large rushes like river bulrush and rivers and lakes. This is a smaller rush called soft rush. It'll grow up to 2 to 3 feet high, forms a nice cylindrical mound shape. It's very attractive, is almost evergreen. Will take standing water, and I've seen it tolerate drying out pretty well too. The only caution I would give you on soft rush is the ends of the stems are very pointy. And so you've got little kids who are going to play in the garden, that one would probably not be a good choice. I have jabbed myself on it a few times. Then again, if you're trying to keep the neighbors out of the garden, that would be a great choice to keep people out of the garden, the pointy ends. Okay, Dot's favorites, the flowers. There are actually several flower species that will grow in totally moist to wet, soggy conditions. An iris, southern blue flag iris, early spring bloomer. There's also a copper iris that's a cousin of this one. I've seen it growing in standing water in stream banks. And good old marsh milkweed. Grows in very moist conditions, in fact needs permanent moisture. Will grow sometimes 3 to 4 feet tall. The foliage is not the most attractive. The flowers are gorgeous though. They hold their blooms a long time. And these are probably the favorite milkweed of the monarchs. You will find that the caterpillars will completely denude the foliage on your marsh milkweeds in the fall when the monarchs come through. Don't let that worry you. The plant will come back, and they absolutely love it. So great, great monarch flower for wet spots. A couple other common flowers that are often used in moist, soggy, wet locations. Blue lobelia on the left and cardinal flower on the right, cousins, both lobelia species. The blue lobelia is a little hardier around here. The cardinal flower is beautiful, very showy, one of our few really nice striking red flowers. It needs constant moisture, so if you've got a location that will dry out good between rainstorms, it probably won't survive here. And it also could use afternoon shade because of our very hot summer sun. So it's sort of a biennial. It'll grow for a year or two, might spread a little bit in the garden by dropping seeds, but it tends not to hang around a long time. Although it's so pretty, it's hard to resist trying it out once in a while. A couple other flowers that do well in moist locations. Joe Pyeweed on the left. Great butterfly plant, pollinator magnet. These beautiful lavender tall flowers. My daughter there is 5'7", so you can see this is a 7-foot high plant. If you have the space for it, it likes moist locations. Maybe good for a back edging along a fence or something. And a couple of the blazing stars. The one pictured here is prairie blazing star, which kind of likes average to moist conditions. And then there is also a marsh blazing star, the Liatra spicata, that truly likes moist or permanently moist conditions. So there are several nice flowers that will take a fair amount of moisture. So what I tend to do in a lot of rain gardens is use sedges as the foundation plants in the low point of the garden. And then I'll punctuate the sedges with some of these flowers in the middle that will tolerate fairly moist to wet conditions. And then as you move up the side slopes of the garden, where it doesn't get as wet or the water doesn't stay around as long, that's where you can use a lot of our favorite plants that just kind of like average conditions. The black-eyed Susan here, or the showy coneflower, doesn't mind being under a couple inches of water as long as it goes away in a day. And there's a lot of flowers like that. So the side slopes is where I often add a lot of color to the gardens. Here's a few common favorites around here, good for both pollinators as well as working into rain gardens. These are, again, for the side slopes. Average moisture conditions. I'm not reading off all the Latin names because we did put them into the slides here. The beard tongue, the white beard tongue on the left, big favorite of the bumblebees. It's blooming right now in town. Will take moist conditions, so it works really well on the side slopes. In the middle are good old purple coneflower. Also tolerates pretty moist conditions. Great for pollinators. Mine is covered in butterflies and bees in midsummer, and goldfinches love the seeds. And if you've ever grown it, you know it puts out a bazillion seeds. It spreads aggressively, so don't be afraid to prune out some of the volunteers. Otherwise, it can kind of take over a garden. And the yellow coneflower on the right, Echinacea paradoxa, is a beautiful, big yellow coneflower. Blooms a little earlier than the purple coneflower. Makes a really nice cutting flower for your garden. Takes the side slopes to the average edges, the average moisture edges of the gardens. And then when you move up to the top edge of the garden, the outside edge of the wet zone, in my rain garden, the top edge dries out very quickly. You can plant just about anything that's one of your favorites that tolerates average to dry conditions. A couple examples here, downy phlox. Phlox pilosa has been blooming over the last 3 weeks in our yard. It's just starting to peter out now. Nice early spring nectar source for the pollinators. And good old butterfly milkweed, bright orange midsummer nectar source, another favorite of the monarchs. So anything that likes average to dry conditions, if you really want to put some in your garden, just put them around the edges. These will not take, of course, the bottom really wet zones of the rain garden. For shady areas, there's a lot of beautiful native woodland wildflowers in this part of the country that like moist conditions, but not permanently wet, saturated conditions. So if you've got moist spots that are shady, a good rich organic matter in a woodland setting like this, if they dry out between storms, several of our woodland wildflowers will work well. Most of them don't tolerate standing water, but they will take temporary saturation after rainstorms. Some of the favorites around here, wild sweet Williams, it was absolutely beautiful this year in the forests around Kansas City. Very, very long bloom time this spring. Early spring blooms. Celandine poppy, a nice bright color for the woodland area, bright yellow flowers, ground cover, a very pretty plant. A very nice ground cover, does well in heavy shade conditions around here, is wild ginger. Spreads readily in shady areas, makes a very nice dense ground cover. A large shrub or a small tree, red buckeye. This is our front yard. About 2 weeks ago, I saw hummingbirds visiting it. So the red tubular flowers are popular with the ruby throats. Couple grasses I wanted to point out do like or tolerate pretty moist conditions, but they have some caveats with them. Switchgrass on the left, this is a picture of the Sprint campus down in Overland Park. Will tolerate dry to almost pretty wet conditions, but the native variety spreads very aggressively by seed and root runners. And same thing with river oats on the right. Kind of a pretty plant with these oat-shaped seed heads dangle off to the side in the fall, an attractive plant, but very heavy seed producer and also spreads aggressively by root runners. So a couple of our native grasses that do very well in moist conditions are good for large landscapes. They're good for erosion control, but if you've got a small garden, they would probably be too invasive for the home garden. So they like damp soil, but be careful where you use them. Grasses in general, I love our native grasses. Little blue stem here on the left and prairie dropseed on the right are just spectacularly beautiful plants. Really nice at adding 3 and 4 season color to your garden. These two won't take really wet conditions. In this photo, what you see in the middle, there's sedges down the middle. This is a long, skinny rain garden. And on the edges of it, where it's drier, we put some native grasses. The little blue stem has this gorgeous copper color that'll hold into the winter. And the prairie dropseed gets this little lighter color, these beautiful airy seed heads. So I encourage you to try out some of our attractive native grasses to add structure and 4 season color to your gardens. But for pretty wet areas, you just have to put them around the edges. And a couple shrubs, black chokeberry, aronia. Some people grow these for the berries for juice and antioxidants. Black chokeberry will take pretty darn wet conditions. And 9 bark here on the lower right. is pretty much a bomb-proof shrub. Once you get it established, it takes a nuclear weapon to remove it. Takes sun to shade conditions, dry to pretty darn wet conditions. Very, very hardy shrub. Good for rain gardens if you need some shrubs, a hedge or privacy, something like that. And a couple trees for very wet locations, as the names might imply, excuse me. River birch does well in wet conditions, also tolerates drying. Bald cypress will grow in standing water. It kind of looks like a conifer, but it drops its leaves in the winter. Pretty light green color. Goes from standing water to summer drying. Very hardy trees, pretty quick growing, tolerate a lot of moisture. So good for pretty wet spots. If you have a really, really wet spot, I'd probably start with the bald cypress. And a couple of our other favorites for color. Black gum on the left here. Gorgeous orange fall color. Tolerates pretty moist conditions. And witch hazel, or Ozark witch hazel, grows in the Missouri Ozarks along Ozark streams. Yellow fall color. And the darn thing blooms in late winter. I've seen it bloom while there's still snow on the ground. So very interesting tree for the home landscape, two of which take fairly moist conditions. A couple other closing points, then we'll open it up to questions here. Most presentations I get on rain gardens, they get questions about what do you do if half the neighborhood drains through your yard? And this is a yard where there's a river running through it after a big rainstorm. There's 5 or 10 acre drainage area upstream of their yard. It all drains through the yard. There's some construction going on with inadequate erosion control, so they're getting mud come through too. And if you've got this problem, a rain garden's not going to solve the problem. You can't just put one little garden in here and soak up all this water. When you've got this much water running through your yard, it's really a matter of routing the water through the yard safely away from your house and addressing erosion control. And probably the two ways that most people tackle erosion control for something like this is either put a rock channel in, a creek bed channel, or not native, but they'll put down sod, which if you have a nice dense sod that doesn't have bare patches in it, it can tolerate a fairly high velocity running across it. So that's a totally different topic from rain gardens, but wanted to bring that up because we typically get questions on it. If need be, that's something that Deep Roots could maybe do another webinar on how to deal with erosion and drainage issues. And a couple of reference books. Places to go for information, of course, start with the Deep Roots website and their sponsors and the nurseries. And the nursery information, you know, like I said earlier, look at the moisture tolerances of the plants, and you pick ones that like dry conditions for the edges of the garden, ones that like moist conditions you put in the bottom, or if you got permanent standing water, then you're looking for plants that the catalogs say need moist to wet conditions. If you've got some really serious landscaping around ponds or streams, look up this book on the left, Plants for Stormwater Design. It's no longer in print, but it's available as a PDF download. You can just Google the name of it and you'll get to it. Got a whole bunch of plant recommendations, and it has moisture depth tolerance for each of the plants. How much water can tolerate being under for how long. So if you have to do landscaping around ponds or wetlands or something like that, it's a super plant reference. Written by a couple of friends of mine up in Minnesota. And then if you just want to build a home rain garden, I've got a rain garden book on the right, available from a really cool bookstore called Terrace Horticultural Books that just sells landscaping and gardening books. It's also available in half-price books around town here as Some people have gotten rid of some of them after workshops I've done. So with that, we'll open it up to questions. If you have written questions that we don't answer today, you can run them through Deep Roots and Stacia will get them to me, or go to mudpieandbutterfly.com here, and you can send a message through the website that Kate and I are building to do some more work with Mud Pie and Dot here. We are working on some ideas to help convey landscaping and plant information in a manner that might appeal to kids as well. Hence the artwork and the pig and the butterfly. So if you got questions for me or you'd like to contact Kate about artwork, feel free to reach out to us there. And Stacia, do I need to stop sharing my screen or leave the screen up?
You can do it either way. You can leave it on that last slide if you'd like, and then we'll switch to a different screen later. But okay. I can go ahead and start sharing some of the questions we've had if you'd like.
Sure, cool.
Terrific, okay. So Val asks, is under the impression that you have to figure the volume of water running off from a roof so that you have the right capacity for the garden. How do you do that?
Ah, okay. Give me a second. I picked some, let me see. I tried to throw in some extra slides just to be prepared for questions.
Wow, you are on top of it.
Val, but I didn't plan on that one.
Oh, no.
So let's pick up a picture of a roof and a rain garden here. This is an elementary school. You can see the roof, the downspout, and they're creating a garden here. So the way I size a rain garden, Val, is the first thing I do is, let me see if I brought that picture. Ah, here it is. You want to dig a hole in your garden location and run an infiltration test. And so you dig a hole maybe about 12 inches wide, 12 inches deep. You fill it full of water. Let the water soak into the soil for, if you can, about an hour to pre-saturate the soil. Fill it up, stick a popsicle stick in the side to mark the water level, look at your watch, measure the time, and then come back an hour later, 2 hours later, 4 hours later, see how fast or how slow the water goes down. And what we're trying to figure out is how many inches the water will go down in 24 hours. So what I do is I make my garden, the depth of the garden, only so deep that the water will go away in 24 hours. And because I don't want to create a mosquito hotel. I want it to catch the water soak into the ground, and the garden dry out in about a day or day and a half. So the first thing I do is figure out how deep my garden is going to be. And then at that point, I measure the length and the width of the roof that's draining to the garden. And for every inch of rain that falls on the roof, you get 0.6 of a gallon of runoff. And I size the area of the garden, knowing the depth, to catch maybe about a 1-inch rainstorm. And another way to look at it is if the garden is 6 inches deep, to hold a 1-inch rainstorm, it needs to be 1/6 the size of the drainage area leading to it. If it's 4 inches deep, it needs to be 1/4 the size. If it's 10 inches, it can be 1/10 the size, because you're taking 1 inch of water off the roof and filling it up 4 or 6 or 10 inches deep in the garden. Hopefully that makes some sense. If it's confusing, drop me an email and I can send you some information that's a little bit more explicit step by step.
Excellent, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Teresa, by the way, wanted to share that the charts, I guess, plant charts were terrific. Thank you for sharing them.
Thank you.
And then Dee Johnson asks, how close to your house can you plant a rain garden?
Oh, another good question. I don't have another slide that illustrates that, but this is a good one to talk off of. There's some rules of thumb out there that says, keep it 10 feet away from your house, but nobody knows where that came from. In this case, this building is a slab on grade foundation. It does not have a basement under it. So the garden is pretty close to the building. I'd still try to keep it, 6 feet away from the building, maybe in that case. If you have a basement, I would keep it at least 10 feet away from the house. If you have a basement that's got water problems like you do, Stacia, I'd keep it farther away. If you've got an old house, it's got like a concrete block basement wall and it leaks, you probably want to be about 20 feet away because you don't want to be soaking water into the ground right next to the house. So it kind of depends on how your house is built too.
Very
But
good.
typically 10 to 20 feet.
Excellent, thank you. I have a personal question. When you were talking about the lobelia possibly being a biannual plant, is that for both the blue and the red, or?
The red.
Okay.
The red is annual to biennial. The blue hangs around a little better.
Okay.
The blue is kind of tall and a little bit floppy too. So, but does take moist conditions, and butterflies like it.
Perfect. Thank you. So Marcia says there's a bioretention basin on her church's property that she would like to plant. Do the same type of plants work in the same way in a bioretention basin?
Okay. Whoa, wow. We got a sharp crowd here. Okay, so Marcia, rain garden picture here is just a bowl that's been excavated, maybe 4, 6, 8 inches deep. And then you just into native soil. You break up the soil if it's compacted, rototill a little bit of compost in it, and plant away. Okay. I think it's the next slide up. I happen to have a picture of a bioretention basin. I'm going to go to full screen so it's a little bit bigger here. This picture in the lower right, this is a bioretention basin which collects the runoff from this parking lot here. I don't have a cross section of it, Marcia, but the bed of the bioretention basin is actually a sandy planting mix, an engineered planting soil with a high sand content in it. And then underneath the sand in the bottom of it is drain pipes that go out to a storm drain. So in the bioretention basin, it drains much faster because it's got that sandy mix in it. So watch it sometime after a rainstorm and see if the water just zips right through it or it hangs around. If the water zips right through it, you're picking plants that can tolerate dry to moist conditions. You don't want the moist to wet conditions because it's going to be very, very well drained. So actually this one here has a mixture of native and non-native. In the bottom is switchgrass, which does very well in those conditions. We've got little blue stem on the edges that are more dry, and then some non-native flowers on the edge of this one. So the trick, Marcia, is to watch it and see how quickly it drains. And then you pick the plants for if it's well-drained conditions or not. What you will see in some bioretention basins is they start out when they're first built and they drain really well because they got this sandy mix in the bottom. And then if they get erosion and the side slopes erode and you get silt or clay washing down, it can plug up the soil mix a little bit. And then they drain slower with time. So you really just need to watch it during a couple rainstorms and see how quickly it dries out.
So last question for the day is, Val asked, should you always have a provision for an overflow?
Oh, great question. Thank you. I didn't cover that. Yes. Let me show you a couple pictures of an overflow. My home rain garden, the water comes in off the driveway here, the garden fills up, In this case, it overflows, goes into another pool, then overflows and spreads out into our yard. In this case, it's kind of hard to see. The water comes in the backside, the pool fills up, and we have a low spot in the rock wall. So when it overflows, it just drains out and spreads out into the yard. Very good question. There will always be a rainstorm that it produces more water than your garden can hold. So I like to pick an overflow spot where I'm going to control how the water gets out of it without causing erosion problems when it fills up and starts spilling over. And that's where I aim it at the neighbor's house if I don't like them. Just kidding. No, good question. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, it sounds like you might have my neighbor. My neighbor's lawn crew came through last week, and our 3-year-old obedience plant was completely decimated. So yeah, neighbors can be great, can't they?
Well, let's talk. We can pick some plants that they won't like and toss some seeds in their yard.
Sounds like a good plan. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my final set of slides.
Okay.
Very good. So thank you again for joining us this afternoon, David. And thank you to our guests for joining us for another terrific webinar. David, I'm sure that if you listen closely, you can hear the applause from around the metropolitan area in appreciation of your time this afternoon. Again, if you have any unanswered questions, David shared his information, and you can feel free to email us at hello@deeprootskc.org. We hope that you find our website to be a great resource. We can help you find native plants, plant a garden, and more. And if you like what you heard today and would like to support Deep Roots and its webinar series, we appreciate your donations and generosity. Finally, don't forget to go outside and play and take a picture with your favorite native plant. Hashtag Fleeing Cocktails, Boulevard Brewing Company, and Native Plant Fleeing. Thank you again for joining us, David, and thank you for taking the time to teach us, and stay well, everyone. Have a great afternoon.